When we think of the Roman Empire, we often picture towering stone cities, aqueducts stretching for miles, and marble temples glowing in the sun. But Rome wasn't built by stone alone. It was built by steel. At the heart of its power lay a simple truth. The Roman soldier was only as strong as the weapons in his hands. And those weapons were unlike anything the ancient world had seen. The Romans didn't invent war, but they perfected it. Where other cultures crafted weapons for individual glory, the Romans engineered theirs for teamwork, efficiency, and domination. Their arsenal wasn't about flashy displays. It was about discipline, precision, and results. The weapon that became the very symbol of Rome was the gladius. The gladius was short, barely 2 feet of sharpened steel. To a modern eye, it might look unimpressive. Compared to the long, sweeping swords of the barbarians, it almost seems underwhelming. But in the hand of a legionary, the gladius became a surgical tool of death. The Romans understood something most enemies didn't. In the chaos of battle, wild swings waste energy and leave you exposed. A slash might look terrifying, but it often bounces off armor or shield. A stab, however, quick, precise, and aimed at the torso, could end a fight in an instant. And when tens of thousands of soldiers advanced shoulder to shoulder, stabbing in perfect rhythm, the battlefield became a machine of silent efficiency. No wasted movement, no unnecessary flourish, just cold mechanical slaughter. But a sword is only as strong as the shield that guards it. And Rome's shield was legendary. The scutum wasn't just a piece of wood and leather. It was a wall, standing, almost as tall as the man who carried it, curved to wrap around his body and reinforced with iron. The scutum turned every soldier into a fortress. Alone, it was powerful, but in formation, it was unstoppable. Picture hundreds of soldiers advancing, together, shields overlapping, forming a solid barrier. To the enemy, it must have felt like the earth itself was moving forward, swallowing them whole. And behind that advancing wall, a storm of stabbing gladi, striking from safety. Even more impressive was the Roman ability to adapt the scutum. When arrows rained from the sky, soldiers raised their shields overhead, locking them together in the famous testudo, or tortoise formation. From the outside, it looked almost comical, a giant box of shields slowly crawling across the battlefield. But under that shell, the Romans were nearly invulnerable. And then came the pilum, Rome's secret weapon against enemy defenses. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary spear, but the brilliance was in its design. The shaft was long and wooden, but the tip was made of soft iron. When hurled at an enemy shield, the pilum didn't just stick, it bent. The iron tip twisted on impact, making the shield heavy and useless. Imagine being a barbarian warrior, lifting your shield to block, only to find it dragging you down, suddenly worthless in your hands. At that moment, you were exposed, and the Roman line was already advancing. Each of these weapons was clever on its own. But what made the Roman arsenal so devastating was how they worked together. The pilum broke defenses, the scutum shielded the soldier, the gladius finished the fight. It was a seamless cycle of destruction, designed not for individual duels, but for the crushing power of the legion as a whole. This was the genius of Rome. Their weapons weren't designed to make heroes, they were designed to make victories. The tribes that Rome labeled as barbarians weren't a single people. They were Celts, Germans, Gauls, countless tribes scattered across forests and plains. And while each had its own traditions, they shared one thing in common. Their weapons were born from a world of survival, not engineering. Where Rome prized discipline, the barbarians prized power. Their weapons didn't look uniform. They weren't mass-produced in state armories. Instead, they were forged by local smiths, handed down from father to son, each carrying the marks of its maker. And when battle came, those weapons unleashed a fury that terrified even the most hardened legionaries. Take the spatha, for instance. Longer than the Roman gladius, it gave the warrior reach, a deadly advantage in open combat. Where the Romans stabbed in tight ranks, the barbarian swung with wide, sweeping arcs, carving through flesh and bone with terrifying force. A skilled fighter with a spatha could keep an opponent at bay, striking before the Roman sword could even find its target. Then there was the axe, brutal, uncompromising. Some were single-handed, light enough to throw. Others were monstrous two-handed, weapons so heavy they could split a shield like firewood. The sight of a charging warrior, both hands gripping an axe, roaring as he closed the distance. This was the kind of raw power that could shake the resolve of even disciplined Roman. Lines, and let's not forget the spear. For many tribes, it was the weapon of choice. Spears were versatile. They could be thrust in close combat or hurled in deadly volleys before a charge. Some warriors carried bundles of javelins, raining them down on Roman shields before rushing in with swords or axes. Unlike the Roman pilum, these weapons didn't bend or break on impact. They were made to be used again and again, turning every barbarian fighter into a storm of iron. What made these weapons even more dangerous was the way they matched the fighting style of their owners. Barbarians didn't march in step. They didn't wait for orders. They charged in waves, each man fighting with ferocious independence. Their weapons reflected that chaos. Long swords for sweeping blows, axes for shattering defenses, spears for overwhelming numbers. To the Romans, this seemed like madness. To the barbarians, it was freedom, and freedom on the battlefield could be terrifyingly effective. So which arsenal truly held the edge? The Roman system, built on discipline and efficiency, or the barbarian armory, forged from chaos and raw power? That question would only be answered when these worlds collided in battle. The battlefield was the only true judge. Steel against steel, shield wall against charging horde. This was where theory met reality. Picture the moment. A Roman legion advancing in perfect formation, shields locked, spears ready. Across the field, the barbarians beat their weapons against their shields, howling with the rage of a people fighting not for empire, but for survival. The air itself seemed to tremble. When the first clash came, it was chaos. Pilums flew in deadly, arcs, crashing into barbarian shields, bending on impact, weighing them down. Many warriors found themselves fumbling, their defenses suddenly useless. And then, the Romans closed in. The gladius was made for this. In the crush of bodies, there was no room to swing a long sword, but a quick thrust, a stab to the ribs, the throat, the gut, deadly. Roman soldiers advanced step by step, their scutums forming an iron wall, their short swords darting like vipers from behind it. Yet the barbarians did not break easily. Their axes came down with bone-shattering force, splintering the edges of shields, sometimes tearing through helmets. Their spathas sliced in long arcs, reaching over Roman defenses, cutting men down with raw power. In the open, where formation faltered, the reach of a barbarian blade could overwhelm the shorter gladius. It was a clash of philosophies as much as weapons. The Romans relied on unity, every man holding the line, trusting the soldier beside him. The barbarians relied on ferocity, every man fighting as though the gods themselves watched his courage. One side a machine, the other a storm. And sometimes, the storm broke the machine. Entire legions were destroyed in forests where Roman formations crumbled, where barbarian fury and longer weapons had room to reign. But in the open fields, where discipline could hold, the Romans turned battle into slaughter, their weapons working together like gears in an unstoppable engine. So whose weapons were stronger? In truth, the answer shifted with the ground beneath their feet. On flat fields, the Roman arsenal ruled. In forests and ambushes, barbarian steel found its bloody triumphs. But this was only part of the story, because a soldier's strength wasn't just in his weapon. It was in the armor that kept him alive long enough to strike. Armor, protection, the silent partner to every weapon. On the battlefield, survival wasn't just about how hard you could strike, but how well you could endure the storm that came back at you. And here, once again, the Romans and the barbarians revealed just how different they truly were. For the Romans, armor was standardized. Step into a legion camp, and you would see rows of soldiers fitted with the iconic lorica segmentata, bands of iron carefully shaped to wrap around the torso, linked with leather straps, allowing flexibility while still guarding the chest and shoulders. To an enemy, a Roman soldier must have looked like a moving fortress, every inch of his body protected by calculated design. Add the gleaming bronze helmet, often adorned with cheek guards, and you had a warrior built to withstand blow after blow. And then, of course, there was the scutum once again. This shield wasn't only a wall in formation, it was a personal bulwark. Rounded at the edges, reinforced with a central iron boss, the scutum could absorb the strike of an axe or sword that might otherwise cripple a man. Together, the armor and shield turned every legionary into a heavily defended cog in the war machine. Now contrast that with the barbarians. Their armor was far from uniform, because most of the time it didn't exist. Many warriors charged into battle wearing little more than leather, fur, or simple chainmail, if they were lucky enough to afford it. Some fought bare-chested, not out of recklessness, but as a deliberate show of courage. A barbarian's protection came less from iron and more from sheer intimidation, speed, and the ferocity of the attack. But that didn't mean they were defenseless. Many tribes made excellent use of round wooden shields, smaller and lighter than the Roman scutum, but quick and maneuverable. Some decorated their shields with symbols meant to terrify: snarling beasts, runes, swirling patterns of blood red. Paint! These shields weren't designed to hold a line. They were meant for personal duels, for sudden parries, for the chaotic dance of close combat. So, here again, we see the philosophy divide. Romans fought as one, their armor and shields designed for collective survival. Barbarians fought as individuals, relying on agility, ferocity, and a willingness to take risks that Romans would never accept. And tactics? That's where the divide grew sharper. Romans drilled endlessly, practicing formations until they became second nature. The testudo against arrows, the wedge against lines, the shield wall against charges. These weren't just maneuvers, they were instincts. A Roman army could shift shape on the battlefield like a single living creature. Barbarians, meanwhile, relied on shock. They used ambushes in forests, sudden charges down hillsides, terrifying war cries meant to rattle the enemy before blades even touched. Their tactics were unpredictable, but unpredictability itself was a weapon. So, which mattered more? Discipline or courage? Iron armor or fearless skin? The answer depended on the day, the ground, the gods of fortune. But one thing is certain: protection shaped not only survival, but the confidence to fight on. And beyond hand-to-hand combat, there loomed another arena where weapons and tactics were tested: the siege. When walls rose high, when gates barred, the way when cities had to fall, the question became, who could break through stone itself? Siege warfare was the ultimate test of a civilization's ability to wage war. A battlefield clash might last hours, but a siege could drag on for weeks, months, even years. And in this grueling contest, weapons alone weren't enough. It took ingenuity, patience, and sheer willpower to topple walls and breach gates. Here, the Romans stood unrivaled. Their engineers were as deadly as their soldiers. They brought with them machines that seemed almost futuristic to the tribes they fought. The ballista, for instance, was a giant crossbow capable of hurling massive bolts with terrifying speed and accuracy. Imagine standing behind a wooden palisade, thinking yourself safe, only to see a bolt the size of a spear smash through the wall and through the men behind it. Then there was the onager, the Roman catapult. Its twisted ropes of sinew and carefully crafted arm could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds. A few well-placed shots, and towers crumbled, walls split, gates shattered. It wasn't just destruction. It was psychological warfare. The thunder of stone smashing into defenses told defenders that Rome would never stop, that their strength was nothing against Roman engineering. And, of course, the famous siege towers. Wooden giants on wheels, bristling with soldiers, shields, and sometimes even artillery. They creaked forward slowly, but once they reached the walls, they allowed legionaries to storm over the top, shields first, gladi ready. To defenders, it must have looked like the earth itself was rising up to swallow their fortresses. Now compare this to the barbarian approach. Lacking the advanced engineering of Rome, most tribes relied on sheer force. Fire was their most common weapon. Torches hurled over walls, gates set ablaze, chaos spreading among defenders. Battering rams were used, but often crudely built, more muscle than mechanics. Ladders were hauled forward, warriors climbing furiously, hoping speed and courage could overcome stone. And sometimes it worked. In the cover of night, in forests, where wood was plentiful, barbarian tribes could swarm fortifications, overwhelming garrisons before Roman reinforcements could arrive. But against a fortified city, against a strong Roman wall, their options were limited. That was the difference. Rome saw war as a science. Barbarians saw it as a storm. Both could be devastating, but in the world of sieges, science usually won. And with every city that fell, with every wall that cracked under Roman stones, the empire expanded, swallowing tribe after tribe. Yet for all their machines and tactics, Rome was not invincible. History remembers moments when Roman arrogance led to disaster. Forts burned, legions cut off, commanders humiliated. Because while siege engines could break stone, they could not always break the will of a people fighting for their home. And that raises the final question. When the dust settled, when swords and shields were laid to rest, whose weapons truly shaped history? The engineered precision of Rome, or the raw fury of the tribes that resisted them? For centuries, Rome and the so-called barbarians clashed across fields, forests, and fortresses. Their weapons were more than just tools of war. They were reflections of their very identities. The Roman arsenal was born of discipline, engineering, and unity. The barbarian arsenal was forged in chaos, ferocity, and independence. Two worlds, two philosophies. The gladius was small, precise, and devastating in formation. The spatha was long, sweeping, and fearsome in open combat. The scutum was a moving wall, built for the collective. The round barbarian shield was lighter, quicker, personal. The pilum was designed to cripple shields and disarm enemies. The barbarian spear was meant for relentless reuse, a storm that never ended. Neither side held a monopoly on strength. The Romans excelled in order, in weapons that worked, as a system, where every soldier was a piece of an unbreakable machine. The barbarians thrived in unpredictability, in weapons that amplified the courage and ferocity of the individual. History, however, tilts toward Rome. Their weapons, combined with strategy, infrastructure, and relentless discipline, allowed them to forge an empire that lasted for centuries. Roads stretched across continents. Cities rose from conquered lands. Laws and culture spread under the shadow of the gladius and scutum. And yet, the story doesn't end there. Because in the long run, it was the barbarians who broke the empire. Their axes splintered shields. Their spathas cut down legionaries. Their fury overwhelmed Rome's order. The empire crumbled, and in its ruins, the so-called barbarians built the foundations of medieval Europe. So, who had the strongest weapons? The answer is both simple and complicated. Rome had the most efficient arsenal, deadly in formation, brilliant in design. The barbarians had weapons of raw power, fueled by spirit and unpredictability. Together, their clash shaped the destiny of the Western world. The strongest weapon in history wasn't a sword or a shield. It was the philosophy behind them. Discipline and unity built an empire. Ferocity and freedom toppled it. And in that eternal struggle between order and chaos, we find the story of Rome and the barbarians who refused to bow.